Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Lately we've been on a real journey trying to beat scenarios using as few tiles as possible. It started with 7 tiles on extreme heights, which later got improved to just 4 tiles. This 4 tile setup is quite widely applicable and it can be used to beat most scenarios with guest goals. But of course even this is not optimal, as the so-called right distraction method can be done with just 3 tiles if you have a maze available. Then suddenly I stumbled upon a way to beat any scenario with the guest goal and no time limit with just 2 tiles, which is another improvement. But the big question remains, is it possible to beat a scenario while using just one single tile? Is there the optimal solution? Well, yes, as I beat Forest Frontiers with just using one tile years ago. However, while this is a valid solution, that's only the case because the goal is so incredibly low. These guests will all want to leave after a few minutes, but you can spawn new guests just quick enough to get to the required 250 guests in those few minutes. Anything higher though doesn't really work. You can't spawn guests any faster, and trapping them in the park with a no entry sign will kill your park rating. So while this is technically a one tile solution, I want something that actually keeps guests in the park. The problem is that after a few minutes the game will send the guests home if they haven't ridden a ride yet, and there's also no ride to head for. You obviously cannot build a ride on just a single tile, so the guests will inevitably want to go home. Except the 2 tile solution I mentioned earlier has a way to get around this. The only things this setup has in the park is a single path piece and a stall, so there's also no ride to ride or head for here. This does make most of the guests leave pretty quickly, but a few stay around, as every time the game tries to make them leave they are interacting with the shop, and when they are doing that they are immune to things like being sent home. Problem is, this method requires guests to interact with something, and that is not possible if you're only allowed to build on one tile. So unfortunately this method won't work either. Or will it? This is the bit of code that sends the guest home, and it's all about the first condition in this if statement. It checks whether the guest is currently in the walking state, and if it is not, then this entire bit that checks if the guest should leave is not executed. That is why the guests that are interacting with the shop at the correct time aren't leaving, as they will be in the buying state instead of the walking state. We already know that we can't put guests in the buying state on just one tile, but what about other states that aren't walking? This is the full list of all 24 possible states a peep can be in. We can immediately cross off these 9, as they are for staff only. Entering park and leaving park are not applicable either, as that's only for guests who are on the map but aren't in the park. We've already seen that for the buying state you need to interact with a stall, and the same goes for the using bin state and the state called 1. The states queuing front, on ride, leaving ride, queuing and entering ride all need functioning ride, so that's not gonna happen. Guests can watch an unfinished ride, so the watching state might theoretically be possible. However, while they will stop and watch a single track piece, they won't watch it when it's directly above or below them, so that peep state isn't possible either. There are now only 3 possible states remaining. Picked sounds great, and a guest that is picked up will indeed never want to leave, but you can only pick up one guest at a time. Sitting has a similar issue, as you can only ever have enough benches on a single tile to seat a few hundred guests. Not that that really matters, as guests won't stay seated for long enough anyway. This now only leaves one peep state, falling, and that is the key to the solution. When a guest is falling, they are in the falling state and thus will not try to leave the park. Okay, we've now found a possible solution, but will it work? Is it actually possible to make all the guests constantly fall down on a single tile? To make sure that whatever strategy I come up with works properly, I did my experiments in Amity Airfield. If the strategy is good enough to get 3000 guests and 600 park rating in 4 years, then I will consider it a valid one tile solution. Before we start working on this, I want to quickly show you an already existing one tile solution that does work work for Amity Airfield, but not for many others. The setup is really simple, just one path piece and a no entry sign to block the exit. Now just advertise and, well, that's it. As we get more guests that can't find the exit and count as lost, the park rating gets lower and lower. Every lost guest gives you -7 park rating, so we quickly go deep into the negatives. Of course, the game simply displays 0, but during the calculation it can get much lower. When we near the deadline at the end of year 4, we have over 5,000 guests in the park and a park rating of about -33,500. It seems like there is no way we're ever going to get to the required 600 park rating, and there indeed isn't, but that's only because OpenRCT2 fixed a glitch from the original game. If we open up this save file in vanilla, the rating quickly shoots up to 999. This happens because the park rating calculation cannot deal with numbers below -32,767, and since we get to about -33,500 here, it loops back around to a rating of over 31,000. This is then limited to 999, but it is easily enough to beat Amity Airfield using just one tile and no rides or stalls. This method was discovered by ZLux and it's a great solution, but because you need so many guests, this is only possible in scenarios that give you 4 or more years. With no rides or stalls, you can only run 2 ad campaigns, the one for the park and the one for free entry. There is also the one for half entry, but in the original game you can only run either half or free entry, not both at the same time, and free entry generates more guests. So while this strategy does work here in Amity Airfield, it does not actually prevent guests from wanting to leave, and instead it abuses an underflow glitch. I really want a solution that requires no glitches or bugs, so let's start working on the falling guest strategy. My first thought is that we need something high up to drop the guests from. That way we can pick them up, put them high up and then drop them down again. We could do this with terrain, but raising and lowering terrain is super expensive, so unless you play a scenario where the maximum loan is hundreds of thousands of euros, you won't be able to afford this. The other option is a piece of path high up in the air, which seems a bit more financially feasible. This is of course still not easy, as we can't simply build a massive staircase. We are confined to one tile after all. No worries though, as there is a way. First, build one sloped piece of path and then start building from the low end of that and remove the path piece. Because the other end was 1 unit higher, that is now the height we're building from. Do this over and over again and you can go as high as you like. It is quite expensive to do this, as path supports cost 5 euros per unit and you only get back 10 bucks when you delete a path piece, no matter how much you paid for it. But after this we'll only have to pay the price of the very highest path piece every time we need to replace it. Once our path piece is in place, the strategy is simple. Constantly advertise, and once a few guests are in the park, we pause the game, pick them up and put them on the path piece. Then we unpause the game and immediately delete the piece to make sure that the guests are only ever falling from this point on. Now we rebuild the path and wait until the fastest of the falling guests have almost reached the bottom. Then we pause the game again and put all guests, including new ones that just entered the park, back on the high up path piece. Rinse and repeat. Once we have a lot of guests in the park, it's going to take absolutely forever to pick them all up, and if you've watched my previous video you may already know what's coming. This is a plugin that can teleport your guests to any place in the park. Unlike the hyper customized one that we use to sell tons of balloons, this one is more generic and could be useful in a variety of situations. You first select the tile and then you can select any surface, water or path that is on that tile. When you click teleport, the plugin will pick up every single guest in the park that can be picked up and put them in the selected position. This is the equivalent of pausing the game and moving all the guests manually, except now it only takes about 1 millisecond per guest. Thanks to this plugin, it is now feasible to perform this challenge run. On the previous video I got some comments that said that they consider this cheating, and I get that, but what I'm after with these videos is finding out the limits of what is theoretically possible within the confines of the game. Everything this plugin does is possible to do manually, except now it's a lot faster, which is why I'm fine with using it. If you want to get it yourself, I've linked it in the description. Once again, thanks to Smithy for making this plugin, it's really helped me out a lot. Despite that help though, this strategy doesn't quite work. The method is fine in theory, but eventually we do run out of money. It costs us 597 euros to replace the path piece every time, and that is unfortunately too much compared to our income. Our only income is from the park entrance, and since the natural gas generation is pretty much zero in this setup, we have to fully rely on ads. As with the park rating underflow method, we can only run 2 ad campaigns, and even though here I'm using half entry instead of free entry to make more money, it's still not enough. So back to the drawing board. We have now learned that we can't make guests drop from really high up, as that is too expensive. But why do we need to do that anyway? When you pick up a guest and place them down again, they aren't placed directly on the surface, but rather a bit above it and first need to fall down a bit. Sure, it's not much and they reach the surface really quickly, but it is enough, and most importantly, it's free. This is even simpler than the previous method. All we have to do is pause the game, pick up and drop all the guests on the only path tile that exists in the entire park, unpause and repause the game before they hit the ground, and then do it again. We need to do this about 4 times a second to prevent guests from hitting the ground, and from that I've calculated that it would take about 60 million clicks to do this manually, so it's time to get out the guest teleporter plugin again. This all works perfectly well now, and the guest count slowly but surely increases without any guests wanting to go home. All we need to do is continue this until the end of year 4 and we'll beat the park. Except for the fact that our park rating is pretty much 0 and we need 600. This happens because even though guests don't want to leave, they do get unhappy while falling. And what's even worse is that entertainers have no effect on falling guests, so there is no way to prevent this from happening. This problem is solvable though, and we will get to that, but first I want to explore some different possible ways of doing this. Earlier we tried dropping the guests from a great height, so that we don't need to pause as frequently, but we found that that was too expensive. However, Nusse discovered that if you repeatedly click on the guest pickup button, they will go a little bit higher every time. Credit to Nusse for the idea of most of this video, by the way. He is the one that came up with the idea of using falling guests to prevent them from going home. This method of repeatedly clicking the pickup button will allow us to teleport any guest to any height we want, but this is of course just as unviable to do manually as just dropping them on the path. There is another method, which is my favorite one, and it's also the one we'll use to actually beat Amity Airfield. This is of course the drowning method. When guests are drowning, they are also in the falling state, so this too prevents them from wanting to leave. We can simply raise the land to have the entry path underground and then have some water on top of that. Now we do the same as before, except we drop every guest in the water instead of on the path piece every few seconds. Because I'm lazy and I don't feel like clicking in the same spot for several hours straight, I used an auto-clicker. I know it's more cheating, but think of this as a tool-assisted challenge run, merely showing what is theoretically possible. I also fast-forwarded through the first 1.5 years, as the remaining 2.5 years is enough to get to the required 3000 guests, and this way we don't have to pick up as many guests near the deadline. With the setup all done, we just have to wait and let the game do its thing. The only thing I have to do is renew the ad campaigns every time they run out. This also nicely gives me the opportunity to adjust the auto-clicker frequency. At the start I had it at every 2.5 seconds, but as we get more guests it takes longer and longer for the plugin to pick up everyone, so I made it go a bit slower every time I renewed the ads, and near the deadline it was only at about once every 5.5 seconds. There is still one massive elephant in the room, and that is the park rating. Just like before, everyone gets unhappy, and as a result we get an abysmal rating. It is slowly getting higher though, as you can get up to 153 points from your guest count, but that is all we will get. We need to get it to 600, and since we cannot build rides or stalls, the only other source of park rating is guest happiness. If at least 83% of your guests is happy, you get the full 500 park rating from that, which would get us to 653, which is enough. So we will need to find a way to make the guests happy at the end of year 4. Guests cannot gain happiness while they are falling, so they have to be on the ground. My plan therefore is simple. Just before the deadline we stop drowning the guests and instead we now trap them in the park on a single piece of path with 50 entertainers, and then we hope to God that the entertainers increase the happiness quick enough to make the guests happy before they get lost and absolutely destroy the park rating. We reached the required 3000 guests in September year 4, so we timed this pretty nicely. On October 23rd, 8 days before the deadline, it's time to start Project Guest Happiness. We hire the entertainers and place the no entry sign, and then it's go time. The guests do want to leave pretty much immediately, but it takes a little while before they actually count as lost and provide -7 park rating. Keep your eye on this number, as that's what we're trying to max out. It is already slowly increasing, as the guests that only recently entered the park don't have all their happiness zapped out of them yet, so they reach the threshold to count as happy quicker. Despite this though, just 2 days before the deadline, still only 1% of the guests are happy. But then, suddenly it shoots up, and on October 31st, the very last day, the park rating crosses the required value of 600. This is just in time, and about 10 seconds later we beat Amity Airfield while using only one tile, building no rides or stalls and abusing no glitches. This was only barely possible, as on March 2nd, as soon as the guests are done applauding, they all get lost and completely obliviate the park rating. Since there is no limit to this penalty, the rating hits an impressive -20,000, and on the graph you can nicely see the perfectly timed very short peak that allowed us to beat the scenario. I never ever expected this to be possible, but despite how amazing this is, we can do even better. This doesn't work in OpenRCT2, but in the vanilla game guests can walk on ghost path pieces. This means that you don't actually have to build the path piece, and you can beat Amity Airfield with nothing built in it. The only things that will be in this park are a ghost path piece, a few thousand guests and briefly some entertainers near the end. You can't beat this. It's literally impossible to build less than nothing. The only thing that could possibly be improved is finding a method that doesn't need entertainers, but that means you'll have to keep guests happy in a park that has literally nothing in it. I think that's very unlikely to happen, but considering all the things we've seen recently, I will call nothing impossible. Of course, there are still plenty of other optimizations to be had. This strategy only works for standard guest goal scenarios where you can advertise, and it's a lot less strong if you charge for the rides, as then you have only one advertisement campaign available. For example, in electric fields you cannot get enough guests quickly enough to get the 100 extra park rating you need from the guest count. To solve this, you can build a single food stall, which gives you 200 extra park rating and allows you to run an extra ad campaign. It's no longer a solution without rides or stalls now, but it's still just one single tile. For goal types like building coasters or getting park value, this strategy obviously doesn't help at all, so I will keep optimizing for other scenario types. To see how I beat Rollercoaster Tycoon without guests riding any rides, click right here. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.